The mountain was a lonely keeper of secrets. Its ridges cut against the sky like broken teeth, its forests hushed beneath layers of heavy snow. Travelers who dared ride through the high passes in winter always spoke of the silence first. Not the beauty, not the terror, but the silence that fell thick as a blanket, muting every hoofbeat, every cry of bird or beast. It was the kind of quiet that made a person hear their own thoughts too sharply, the kind of quiet that could undo a soul. And in that quiet lived a man named Jedediah Boone. The townsfolk in Dry Creek said no woman could last with him, not even for a week. They told it with a shake of the head, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with pity. They told it because gossip runs hotter than a wood stove in winter, and it warms people more than truth ever could. One bride had left by the third day, her hands raw from failed bread and her cheeks streaked with tears. Another had bolted into town on the sixth day, clutching her carpetbag as though her life depended on it, while the children jeered and the women whispered, "Another one gone." So when word spread that yet another mail-order bride was coming up the pass to marry Jedediah Boone, the saloon filled with knowing smirks. The blacksmith spat in the snow and said, "Reckon she'll last 4 days, maybe 5 if she's stubborn." But stubborn is not the same as broken. Her name was Temperance Walker, though most called her Tempy. She was 28, neither young nor old, and her body carried the weight of every cruel word flung her way. She was broad-hipped, thick-armed, and heavy enough that in church pews she often heard the creak beneath her and the muffled chuckles of men who thought themselves clever. She had no illusions about beauty, no hopes of being called graceful. But she carried inside her a steel thread of resolve, a quiet refusal to bend, though many had tried to break her. When she stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek, the air was sharp with snow. Her boots sank into the drift by the boardwalk. Children stared. A pair of women at the mercantile covered their mouths and whispered. One of them, thin as a broom handle, murmured, "Lord, she'll not last the week." Tempy heard. She always heard. And though her cheeks burned, she did not lower her gaze. Jedediah Boone stood waiting beside his mule, a figure of rough silence. He was a man built more of mountain than flesh, broad shoulders under a patched coat, beard streaked with frost, eyes pale as the winter sky. He gave her no smile, only a nod, as though acknowledging not a bride but a responsibility. The ride to his cabin was long and wordless. Snow clung to her skirts, the cold biting through her gloves until her fingers ached. She tried to study him, this man whose name carried warnings like thunder, but his face revealed nothing. He looked ahead, always ahead, as if the trail itself demanded his whole being. By the time the cabin came into view, twilight had already begun to press its violet hands across the peaks. The place was smaller than she imagined. A one-room shelter of logs darkened by age, roof sagging under snow, smoke curling from a stone chimney. Pines crowded close as though keeping watch. Inside it was sparse. A rough-hewn table. A bed against the far wall. A wood stove radiating faint heat. No lace, no softness, no sign a woman had ever made a home there. Tempy set her small trunk by the door, her heart heavy but her jaw firm. The first nights were the hardest. The stove never seemed warm enough. The wind crept through every crack. She tried to bake bread but failed, the crust turning hard as stone. Her hands, unused to chopping wood, blistered until she wrapped them in rags. Jedediah said little. He watched her with the same stillness he gave the fire or the mountains, as though she were another piece of wilderness he could not tame. But he did not mock her. He did not raise his voice. Instead she noticed small things. A stack of extra firewood by the stove, set there when she wasn't looking. The bucket he filled with water before dawn, so she would not have to trudge through the snow herself. These gestures spoke louder than the silence. And Tempy, in return, made small offerings of her own. She swept the floor though the dirt never stayed gone. She mended a tear in his coat with clumsy stitches. She placed a bowl of beans on the table each evening, no matter how meager the meal. Neither spoke of gratitude, yet both felt its weight. Still, loneliness was a sharp edge. When Jedediah took her down to Dry Creek one Saturday for supplies, the whispers rose again like smoke. Women gathered their shawls tighter, eyes narrowing. One man snorted loud enough for all to hear, "Guess Boone finally found a woman stubborn enough to eat the wolves out of house and home." Laughter followed, brittle and mean. Tempy's face burned, shame crawling through her bones. She gripped the sack of flour in her arms tighter, every step heavier. Jedediah said nothing, but she noticed the way his jaw clenched, the way his hand tightened on the strap of the grain sack slung over his shoulder. He walked beside her with the silence of a storm about to break, and for the first time she felt not alone in her humiliation but shielded by it. That night, back at the cabin, the fire burned low. Tempe sat with her sewing, needle trembling in her hand. Jedediah sat across from her, carving a piece of wood with a small, worn knife. For a long while, the only sound was the crack of the fire and the scrape of blade on pine. At last she asked softly, "Why do they hate you so?" His hand stilled. He did not look up. "I don't fit their world." Neither did she. The days stretched, marked by the rhythm of survival. Fetch water. Split wood. Cook beans. Patch clothes. Each task small, ordinary, yet each carried weight in the cold silence of the mountain. She found herself watching him, not his strength or scars, but the quiet grief in his eyes when he thought no one noticed. She discovered a small carving tucked in a shelf, a wooden horse worn smooth by touch. When she asked, he said only, "My father made it." His voice cracked, though only slightly, as though memory itself hurt. Winter deepened. Wolves howled in the distance. Snow piled high against the door, pressing them closer together inside. She learned the rhythm of his silences, and he began to learn the sturdiness of her presence. Sometimes she caught him glancing at her as though puzzled that she still remained. The others had fled. She had not. One night, the wind rose, howling against the walls as though the mountain itself sought to drive them out. Tempe sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Her body ached from work, her heart from the weight of gossip and doubt, but still she remained. She told herself she would not leave. She could not. For in his silence, she had begun to hear something other than rejection. She had begun to hear her own worth echoing back. And in that storm, with the wolves crying and the fire low, she whispered a vow only the night could hear. "I will not be sent away. Not by them. Not by him. Not by the storm." The mountain held its breath. The storm came heavier than the ones before, a weight of sky that pressed the cabin into the earth. For 3 days the snow fell without mercy. It whispered against the roof in the long dark hours and roared in sudden gusts that rattled the shutters. Inside, Tempe and Jedediah lived in the narrow world of their one-room shelter, firewood dwindling, silence stretched taut as a wire. At first she feared the closeness more than the cold. The way his large frame filled the space, the scrape of his boots on the planked floor, the heat of his presence when he passed near her chair. They spoke little, yet every silence seemed louder for the walls that held it in. He spent hours mending traps, sharpening blades, staring out at the endless white. She sewed patches onto his shirts, her fingers raw but steady. On the second night, when the wind shrieked loud enough to shake the rafters, he slammed the door of the woodbin so hard the walls shook. His shoulders heaved, breath sharp with something that was not quite anger and not quite despair. Tempe sat still, her sewing in her lap, and watched the storm inside him burn. She did not flinch. She did not scold. She only rose, fed another log to the fire, and returned to her chair. The simple act steadied the air between them, a reminder that not all storms called for battle. His gaze flicked to her then just once, with something like shame in it. He said nothing. She answered with silence, but her silence carried mercy. The days dragged, yet in small ways the ice between them began to thaw. One morning Jedediah brought the axe to her hands and led her out into the snow. The wind bit hard at their faces, but the sky had cleared. He set a log upright and showed her how to hold the handle, how to let her weight guide the swing instead of her arms. She tried and failed, the blade glancing off with a hollow thunk. Again she tried, and again the log stood unbroken. Sweat prickled her brow despite the cold. Finally the blade bit clean through and the log split in two. She stumbled, breathless, but smiled despite herself. He gave a low nod, just a fraction of approval, but enough to light warmth in her chest. Another evening, when the world outside lay buried in moonlit snow, she hummed softly as she mended a shirt. The tune was one her mother had sung, an old hymn that carried the memory of summer winds and fields long gone. Her voice was not pretty, not trained, but it was steady and low, a comfort more than a performance. Jedediah's hand stilled on the carving knife. He did not lift his head, but she saw the way his shoulders eased, the way his breath slowed as though he too remembered something gentler. For the first time she felt the cabin less like a cage and more like a shared shelter. But peace never held long on the mountain. The wolves came closer. Their howls split the night, no longer distant echoes but sharp cries from the tree line. Jedediah rose at once, rifle in hand, eyes narrow. Tempe's heart pounded, yet she followed him to the door. Outside the air burned cold in her lungs. The pines stood dark against the snow, shadows shifting. A shape darted between the trees, then another. Yellow eyes gleamed. Jedediah stepped forward, gun steady. But the snow was deep, the ground treacherous. The wolves circled, hunger driving them near. One lunged, snapping, and he fired, thunder cracking the stillness. The beast fell, but two more came, teeth bared. Jedediah swung the rifle like a club, but the ice betrayed him. He stumbled, crashing to one knee. Tempe did not think, only moved. She seized a half-frozen log from the woodpile and swung with all her strength. The blow landed hard against the flank of a wolf, sending it yelping back into the dark. Her arms shook with the force, breath tearing her throat, but she swung again, wild and desperate, until the animal scattered into the trees. Silence returned, ragged and heavy. Her hands trembled, knuckles white on the log. Jedediah rose slowly, eyes fixed on her, not with anger, not with pride, but with something deeper, as though he had seen her for the first time. Together they dragged the fallen wolf away and barred the door. Inside, the fire hissed low. She slumped into the chair, her whole body quaking. Jedediah knelt before her, taking her hands in his. His palms were rough, his grip gentle. He saw the raw frostbite on her fingers, the way her skin cracked from the cold. Without a word, he fetched a cloth, warmed it, and wrapped her hands. His touch was careful, reverent even, as though he feared breaking something precious. She watched his face, the line of his brow, the tightness in his jaw. At last he spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "You stayed." Just 2 words. But they filled the room. Tears burned her eyes, unbidden. For years she had been called burden, mistake, too much of one thing and not enough of another. She had been turned aside, laughed at, left behind. And now this man, who frightened half the town, who could barely shape words into air, gave her the one truth she had longed to hear. She endured. She mattered. In the days that followed, something in their silence changed. He taught her how to check traps, how to tell the difference between fox tracks and hare. She showed him how to mend torn seams with patience rather than haste. He carved her a small figure of a bird, no larger than her palm, its wings folded as though waiting for spring. She placed it on the shelf where sunlight struck it each morning, and each time she looked at it, she felt a quiet strength build inside her. When the snow at last began to soften, dripping from the eaves in slow rivulets, Jedediah hitched the mule for a trip into town. Supplies had grown thin, the cabin needed nails and cloth and new blades. Tempe went with him, though her heart clenched at the thought of the stairs. The townsfolk had not changed. The blacksmith's wife smirked as they passed. 2 men outside the saloon laughed openly, one calling, "Looks like Boone found a woman too stubborn to freeze." The words cut sharp as ever, but this time Tempe did not bow her head. She squared her shoulders, her steps steady on the boardwalk. Inside the mercantile, a knot of women gathered near the counter, whispering behind gloved hands. One finally said loud enough for all to hear, "She only stayed 'cause she had no choice. Any other would have run." Tempe turned then, calm but fierce, her voice carrying over the shelves of flour and salt. "I stay because I chose to." The room hushed. The women blinked, startled by her tone. She did not falter, did not let her voice crack. "No storm, no man, no whisper of yours drove me to it. I chose to stay. And that makes me stronger than any of you know." Jedediah stood at her side, silent as stone, but his presence filled the room like thunder. The mockery faltered, the smirk slid away. One by one they turned back to their shopping, their laughter hollow. As they left, Tempe's hand brushed against Jedediah's arm. He did not speak, but his eyes found hers, and in that quiet glance lay more respect than any declaration could hold. Back at the cabin, the snow melted into rushing streams, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and earth. The mountain shed its cloak of white, revealing again its scars and ridges, its strength. On a golden evening, the two of them sat on the stoop, watching the sun sink low over the peaks. The sky burned with color, crimson and gold spilling into the horizon. Jedediah's hand rested near hers, not touching, but close enough that the warmth of him reached her. The silence between them was no longer a burden. It was a bond. And as the narrator's voice closes, it speaks not only of them but of all who have been cast aside. Some stay because they must, some because they cannot leave. But the rarest are those who stay by choice. And in that choice lies freedom. In that freedom, love. Remember this, you who have felt unworthy. Dignity is not given, it is claimed, quietly, stubbornly, against the laughter of the world. And once claimed, it can never be taken. The mountain stood tall, the snow glowing in twilight, and in its heart 2 souls who had found not perfection but endurance. And sometimes endurance is enough to birth love.